Prepare yourself. Today, we will dive into the deep and terrifying shadows of Charleston's history. This is, without a doubt, one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters this city has ever seen. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments below where you're watching this video from and what time it is. And also, if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily cases. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. In the autumn of 1888, when the streets of Charleston still echoed with the lingering whispers of the Civil War, a peculiar advertisement appeared in the Charleston Daily News. It read, "Seamstress of exceptional skill, available for special commissions, specializes in final garments, discretion assured. Inquire at 17 Lagar Street." The advertisement appeared only once, but it was enough to spark curiosity among certain circles of Charleston society. 17 Lagar Street stood in the heart of what locals called the Haunted District, not for any supernatural occurrence, but for the heavy silence that seemed to blanket the area. The three-story house, with its weathered facade and black shutters, had been empty for nearly 7 years, following the death of its previous owner, Judge William Pinckney. No one expected it to be occupied again, much less by a woman who called herself only Mrs. Cotton. According to records from the Charleston Historical Society, Mrs. Cotton arrived in the city on September 3, 1888. She was described by those who glimpsed her arrival as tall and severe, dressed entirely in black, with a face that betrayed no emotion. She purchased the Lagar Street property with cash, an unusual transaction that raised eyebrows among real estate agents of the time. The deed of sale, which still exists in the Charleston County Archives, bears no first name, only the signature E. Cotton. What made Mrs. Cotton's arrival particularly noteworthy was the timing. Charleston in 1888 was experiencing what local newspapers referred to as the quiet epidemic, a series of deaths that seemed to strike the city's most prominent families. These deaths, while not suspicious enough to warrant police investigation, occurred with such frequency that the city's 4 funeral homes could barely keep pace with the demand. It was in this atmosphere of quiet grief that Mrs. Cotton established her business. Within weeks, word spread among Charleston's elite about the seamstress on Lagar Street who created burial garments of exceptional beauty. Those who commissioned her work spoke in hushed tones about the garments' remarkable quality, how they seemed to capture something of the deceased's essence in their stitching. Mrs. Cotton operated by strict protocols. Clients were received only by appointment, always after dusk. She required a personal item belonging to the deceased, a lock of hair, a favorite handkerchief, or even a diary page. Most peculiarly, she insisted on meeting alone with the deceased before beginning her work, a practice that would have been scandalous had it not been protected by the shroud of grief and the client's desperate desire for something beautiful to mark their loved one's passage. By December of 1888, Mrs. Cotton had sewn burial garments for 7 of Charleston's most prominent citizens. Each funeral where her work was displayed drew whispers of both admiration and unease. Observers noted how the garments seemed to fit the deceased with uncanny precision, as if tailored specifically for their final pose. One funeral attendee, Elizabeth Ravenel, wrote in her diary, "The Colonel looked more himself in death than he ever did in his final years of life. The suit clung to him as if it were a second skin, moving with him rather than against him. I cannot explain the discomfort this observation brings me. What happened next is documented in the meticulous journals of Dr. James Carlisle, who served as Charleston's medical examiner from 1876 to 1891. On December 28, 1888, the body of Harold Wentworth, scion of the Wentworth shipping empire, was found in his bed at his home on Meeting Street. The death was initially attributed to heart failure, a common diagnosis in those times when medicine had limited means to determine precise causes of death. When Dr. Carlisle arrived to examine the body, He made a notation that would later become significant. The deceased clutches in his right hand a swatch of white cotton fabric, his fingers locked around it with such rigidity that it cannot be removed without breaking the digits. The swatch was later determined to be of the same material used by Mrs. Cotton in her burial garments. The Wentworth family, despite the unusual circumstance, commissioned Mrs. Cotton to create Harold's burial suit. According to Margaret Wentworth's correspondence with her sister in Savannah, preserved in the Charleston Museum's private collection, Mrs. Cotton arrived at the Wentworth home just after midnight to view the body. She spent 3 hours alone with the deceased, during which time the household staff reported hearing what they described as the soft murmur of one-sided conversation coming from behind the closed doors. 3 days later, when Harold Wentworth was laid to rest in Magnolia Cemetery, witnesses described his burial suit as unnervingly lifelike. The jacket appeared to rise and fall slightly, as if with breath, an effect attributed by some to the movement of the pallbearers. More disturbing were the accounts that claimed the fabric seemed to pulse with a rhythm independent of its handling. These observations were dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations by Dr. Carlyle, who noted in his journal, "The mind, when confronted with the ultimate stillness of death, will impose movement where there is none, as a means of denying the finality it cannot accept." What makes the Wentworth case particularly noteworthy is what followed. In the weeks after his burial, 3 people who had been present at his funeral, his business partner, his cousin, and his valet, reported identical dreams in which Harold Wentworth stood at the foot of their beds, his burial suit writhing against his still form, threads unwinding from the seams to reach toward the dreamers. All 3 died within a month, each found in their beds with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Medical records list the cause as seizure of unknown origin. In each case, Mrs. Cotton was commissioned to create their burial garments. By February of 1889, Mrs. Cotton had created burial garments for 14 of Charleston's dead. A pattern began to emerge, noticed first by Dr. Carlyle, who kept a private ledger of deaths in the city. Those who wore Mrs. Cotton's garments in death seemed to pull others after them, family members, close friends, servants who had viewed the body, at a rate that defied statistical probability. Dr. Carlyle noted that within 2 months of a burial featuring Mrs. Cotton's work, an average of 3 people connected to the deceased would themselves die. The doctor's concerns might have remained private had it not been for the death of Judge Bartholomew Pierce on February 17th. Judge Pierce had presided over a contentious property dispute involving land on which a former slave cemetery was located. His ruling, which allowed for the cemetery's desecration in favor of commercial development, had been deeply unpopular. When he died suddenly of what appeared to be apoplexy, his widow commissioned Mrs. Cotton. According to accounts from the household staff, Mrs. Cotton arrived at the Pierce residence on Sullivan's Island with a large trunk containing various fabrics and threads. What was unusual about this visit was that Mrs. Cotton requested that the judge's body be transported to her home on Laguerre Street, a request that violated both custom and propriety. More unusual still, the widow agreed. Judge Pierce's body was moved under cover of darkness to 17 Laguerre Street, where it remained for 2 days. When it was returned, the judge was already dressed in his burial suit, a garment of such intricate stitching that the funeral director, Thomas Whitridge, later told Dr. Carlyle it appeared to contain thousands more stitches than any garment could practically require. Most disturbing were the patterns those stitches formed, whirling concentric circles centered over the heart, with thin lines radiating outward to the extremities, like a web spanning the entire garment. The judge's funeral was attended by the entirety of Charleston's legal establishment. 5 days later, the first of them died. Court clerk Philip Rodney, found at his desk with his pen still in hand, and an expression of profound terror on his face. Over the next 3 weeks, 2 judges, 4 attorneys, and 3 jurors who had served on Judge Pierce's final case died under similar circumstances. Each was buried in a garment created by Mrs. Cotton. It was at this point that Dr. Carlyle decided to investigate Mrs. Cotton directly. His journal entry from March 7, 1889 reads, "The pattern can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Whatever process Mrs. Cotton employs in her work appears to create a chain of death that expands outward from the initial deceased. I have requested an interview with the seamstress under the pretense of commissioning a suit for my still living self. God forgive the deception, but I must understand what dark art she practices with needle and thread." Dr. Carlyle's visit to 17 Lagar Street is documented in detail in his journal. He described the house as unnervingly still, as if the air itself were held in suspension. The interior was sparsely furnished, with the exception of the sewing room, which contained an elaborate loom of unfamiliar design and shelves lined with spools of thread in varying shades of white. Dr. Carlyle noted that the threads appeared to shimmer slightly in the candlelight, an effect he attributed to some unknown treatment of the cotton. Mrs. Cotton received him in a sitting room whose walls were covered in framed samples of fabric, each labeled with a name and date. Dr. Carlyle recognized many of the names as recently deceased citizens of Charleston. He described Mrs. Cotton as a woman of indeterminate age, with pale skin that has never seen the sun, and fingers unnaturally elongated, as if stretched over years of pulling thread. Her eyes hold no color I can name. The interview proceeded cordially until Dr. Carlyle inquired about her process. According to his account, Mrs. Cotton replied, "I merely listen to what the deceased wishes to say, doctor. Everyone leaves with unfinished conversations. I provide the thread through which those words might finally find expression. And are you still enjoying this story? Help us spread this mystery by liking the video. Also, leave a comment below if you've ever heard of this case or legend before. Don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's get back to the twist. When Dr. Carlyle pressed for more concrete details, Mrs. Cotton offered to demonstrate. She led him to a workroom at the rear of the house, where a man's jacket lay half-completed on a table. Dr. Carlyle recognized the fabric as matching a swatch found in the hand of Harold Wentworth. Mrs. Cotton picked up a needle, already threaded with white cotton, and asked Dr. Carlyle to specify someone he knew who had recently died. Against his better judgment, the doctor named his colleague, Dr. Frederick Hollings, who had passed away the previous month from consumption. Mrs. Cotton nodded, closed her eyes for a moment, and then began to sew. Dr. Carlyle described what followed. Her hands moved with impossible speed, the needle flashing silver in the lamplight. As she worked, I could swear I heard Hollings' voice, that distinctive whisper roughened by his disease, emanating not from her, but from the thread itself as it passed through the fabric. What I heard chilled me. "James, I tried to tell you about the pain. None of you listened, but she hears us. She gives us voice. She helps us reach back." Dr. Carlyle fled the house, his scientific skepticism shaken. His journal entry concludes, "I cannot reconcile what I experienced with any rational explanation. If even a fraction of what I suspect is true, then every garment that woman creates becomes a conduit through which the dead may influence the living. The implications are too terrible to contemplate." The doctor's concerns prompted a discreet investigation by the Charleston police, led by Captain Robert Stinson. Officers surveilled the house on Lagar Street for 2 weeks, but reported nothing unusual beyond the late-night arrivals of carriages bearing coffins. A search of municipal records revealed nothing about Mrs. Cotton's background or origin. It was as if she had materialized in Charleston fully formed, with no history attached to her name. What might have remained an unsettling mystery escalated dramatically on April 2, 1889. Ellen Bryce, wife of prominent banker Thomas Bryce, was found dead in her dressing room, surrounded by scraps of white fabric. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, though there were no signs of struggle or external injury. The peculiar aspect of her death was the position in which she was found, seated at her vanity, arms outstretched as if being measured for a garment. Thomas Bryce, against the private advice of Dr. Carlyle, commissioned Mrs. Cotton to create his wife's burial gown. According to the household staff, Mrs. Cotton arrived with a garment already completed, a statistical impossibility given that Mrs. Bryce had died only hours before. When questioned, Mrs. Cotton reportedly said, "She has been speaking to me for days. She knew her time was approaching." The Bryce funeral became a turning point. The burial gown Mrs. Cotton created was described by attendees as breathtaking in its beauty and disturbing in its precision. The intricate embroidery across the bodice appeared to form words when viewed from certain angles, words that different viewers interpreted differently, each claiming to see messages of personal significance. Within a week of the funeral, Thomas Bryce began to report, hearing his wife's voice emanating from the empty rooms of their home on Trad Street. Servants reported finding him in conversation with the heir, responding to questions no one else could hear. On April 12th, he was found dead in his wife's dressing room, his body contorted into the same position in which she had been discovered, with threads of white cotton wrapped around his fingers so tightly they cut into the flesh. By mid-April, Charleston was gripped by what the newspapers delicately termed nervous tension. Deaths continued at an alarming rate, each followed by the commissioning of Mrs. Cotton's services, each funeral followed by more deaths. Dr. Carlyle's ledger from this period shows that the chain of mortality had extended to people with increasingly distant connections to the originally deceased, from immediate family to casual acquaintances, as if the influence were expanding outward in concentric circles. On April 23rd, Dr. Carlyle made a discovery that transformed his unease into active horror. While reviewing death records from other cities, he found a pattern of similar occurrences dating back decades. In Savannah, 1866 to 1868, Richmond, 1871 to 1873, and Atlanta, 1877 to 1879. In each case, a seamstress of remarkable skill appeared in the city. Deaths increased dramatically among the elite, and the seamstress vanished without trace after approximately 1 year. More disturbing still, each disappearance coincided with a final death of particular note. In Savannah, the mayor; in Richmond, a prominent judge; in Atlanta, the city's wealthiest industrialist. In each case, the prominent figure was survived by a widow who herself disappeared shortly thereafter. Dr. Carlyle's notes speculate it is as if Mrs. Cotton, if that is indeed her name, moves from city to city, weaving her web of death until she captures a particular prize. But what is the purpose? What connects these final victims? The doctor's investigation was interrupted by a development that shifted the course of events. On April 29th, 7-year-old Catherine Pinckney, granddaughter of the judge who had previously owned the house on Lagar Street, went missing. Catherine had been seen that afternoon walking home from her piano lesson on Broad Street, passing within a block of 17 Lagar Street. She never arrived at her family's home on South Battery. The disappearance of a child from one of Charleston's most prominent families mobilized resources that mere suspicious deaths had not. Captain Stinson ordered a thorough search of the city, including, despite social reservations about invading a woman's private domain, Mrs. Cotton's residence. According to police records, when officers arrived at 17 Lagar Street on the morning of April 30th, they found the door unlocked and the house empty of human presence. What they discovered inside forms the most disturbing chapter of this narrative. The sewing room at the rear of the house had been transformed. The floor was covered with white fabric arranged in a perfect circle. At the center stood the loom, now modified in ways the officers struggled to describe. Threads extended from the loom to the walls, ceiling and floor in an elaborate three-dimensional pattern that Captain Stinson likened to a web designed by a spider that understood mathematics. More disturbing were the spools of thread that lined the shelves. Upon closer inspection, officers discovered that what they had taken for white cotton was something else entirely. Dr. Carlyle, called to the scene, made a detailed examination and concluded that the thread was human hair, bleached white through some unknown process, and spun with extraordinary fineness. Later examination of garments recovered from recently buried bodies confirmed this assessment. Each burial garment created by Mrs. Cotton was sewn with thread made from human hair. The search for Catherine Pinckney intensified. Officers discovered a hidden cellar beneath the house on Lagar Street, accessible through a trapdoor concealed under the loom. The cellar contained hundreds of spools of the hair thread, each labeled with a name, names that Dr. Carlyle recognized as belonging to the deceased for whom Mrs. Cotton had created burial garments. There was no sign of Catherine Pinckney in the cellar, but officers did find a half-completed child's dress hanging on a dressmaker's form. The dress was made of white fabric with intricate embroidery that, upon closer examination, formed tiny scenes depicting various locations around Charleston. Most disturbing was the discovery that the embroidery on the left sleeve showed the interior of the Pinckney home, a location Mrs. Cotton had never visited. The city was gripped by panic. Parents kept their children indoors. Adults traveled in groups. The house on Lagar Street was placed under constant guard, though there was no sign that Mrs. Cotton had returned. As the search for both the missing seamstress and Catherine Pinckney continued, Dr. Carlyle made a connection that had eluded investigators. Reviewing historical records from the cities where similar incidents had occurred, Dr. Carlyle discovered that in each case, the final prominent death had been of a man whose family had, generations earlier, been involved in textile production using slave labor. The Pinckney family of Charleston fit this pattern. Judge William Pinckney's grandfather had owned one of the largest cotton plantations in South Carolina, worked by over 300 enslaved people. On May 7th, a breakthrough occurred. A groundskeeper at Magnolia Cemetery reported unusual activity at the Wentworth family mausoleum. Officers arrived to find the heavy stone door ajar. Inside, the coffin of Harold Wentworth had been opened. The body remained, but the burial suit Mrs. Cotton had created was missing. Similar discoveries followed at other grave sites. In each case, the garments Mrs. Cotton had created were gone, while the bodies remained undisturbed. Dr. Carlyle's journal from this period contains a disturbing theory. She is collecting her work, or rather, collecting what her work has gathered. Each garment, sewn with thread, spun from the hair of the dead, worn by another dead, becomes imbued with a particular essence. The garments are not the end product of her labor, but merely vessels for collecting something else. On May 12th, 13 days after her disappearance, Catherine Pinckney was found, alive, but in a state of shock, seated on the steps of St. Michael's Church. She was dressed in a white gown of the same fabric observed in Mrs. Cotton's workshop, embroidered with scenes from around Charleston. The child was physically unharmed, but would not or could not speak. She carried a folded piece of paper bearing a message written in an elegant hand. "The debt is not yet paid in full. I will return when the cotton blooms again." Catherine Pinckney never spoke again. According to medical records from the Charleston Asylum, where she was eventually committed in 1896, she spent her days mechanically mimicking the actions of sewing, her fingers moving through the air as if pulling invisible thread through invisible cloth. The asylum records note that on the anniversary of her discovery each year, she would become agitated and attempt to create circular patterns on the floor of her room using any materials at hand, bed sheets, clothing, even her own hair. The house on Lagar Street remained empty for decades. Attempts to sell it failed. Attempts to occupy it ended with the new residents fleeing within weeks, reporting sounds of scissors cutting cloth in empty rooms and the sensation of threads tightening around their throats as they slept. Eventually, the city seized the property for non-payment of taxes, but no municipal use was ever found for it. It stood vacant, a silent reminder of the events of 1888 and 1889. Dr. I.T. Carlyle continued his investigation long after official interest had waned. His journals from the 1890s contained correspondences with colleagues in cities across the South, tracking reports of unusually skilled seamstresses and clusters of deaths among prominent families. He believed he was mapping Mrs. Cotton's movements, though he never managed to arrive in a city while she was still present. His final journal entry, dated October 3, 1899, reads, "I have received word from New Orleans of a woman creating burial garments of exceptional beauty. I leave on tomorrow's train. I believe I have finally understood her pattern. She returns to cities in cycles of decades, once the previous generation has passed and the memory of her has faded to legend. What I cannot yet grasp is her purpose. What does she gather through her terrible work? What power accumulates in those threads spun from the hair of the dead? And for what ultimate design is she weaving this web that spans decades and cities?" Dr. Carlyle never returned from New Orleans. According to a brief item in the Charleston Daily News, dated October 7, 1899, his body was discovered in his hotel room with no signs of violence or struggle. The coroner's report listed the cause as heart failure. The article noted that he was buried in New Orleans in a suit of remarkable craftsmanship provided by an anonymous benefactor. In 1921, during renovations of the long-abandoned house on Legare Street, undertaken as part of a historic preservation initiative, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the attic. Inside was a dress form bearing an elaborate wedding gown made entirely of white fabric sewn with thread that, upon examination, proved to be human hair. The gown was covered in intricate embroidery depicting scenes from Charleston's history, including events that had occurred after Mrs. Cotton's disappearance in 1889. Most disturbing of all, the scenes showed not the city's grand moments, but its darkest ones. Slave auctions on the steps of the Exchange Building, public whippings at the workhouse, the hanging of Denmark Vesey and his co-conspirators. Interspersed with these historical scenes were depictions of the funerals of those who had worn Mrs. Cotton's burial garments, rendered with such precision that individuals in attendance could be recognized. The wedding gown disappeared from the Charleston Museum in 1923. The night watchman reported hearing the sound of scissors just before discovering the gown's absence. In his statement, he claimed to have seen a tall woman in black exiting the building, though security had been locked. He noted that she carried a large case similar to those used by traveling seamstresses of the previous century. In 1942, an advertisement appeared in the Charleston Evening Post. Seamstress of exceptional skill available for special commissions. Specializes in final garments. Discretion assured. Inquire at 17 Legare Street. By then, the story of Mrs. Cotton had faded from public memory. Only archivists and historians recognized the significance of the address. The advertisement appeared for only one day. When police investigated, they found the house on Legare Street still vacant and locked. Yet in the months that followed, funeral directors around Charleston reported a curious phenomenon. Families were bringing in burial clothes they claimed had been delivered anonymously, garments of exceptional quality, with embroidery so fine it could hardly be seen with the naked eye. The pattern began again. Deaths among Charleston's prominent families increased. Those who attended the funerals of people dressed in the mysterious garments often died themselves within weeks. The cycle continued for approximately 1 year before tapering off, leaving behind no evidence except a series of graves containing bodies dressed in garments whose threads had anyone thought to examine them microscopically, were spun from human hair. The most recent documented appearance of what some historians believe to be Mrs. Cotton occurred in Charleston in 1967. A woman matching her description rented a room on Lagar Street, not at number 17, which had finally been demolished after a fire in 1958, but at number 22, directly across the street. She advertised her services through word of mouth among the city's oldest families, creating not burial garments, but baptismal gowns. These gowns, like their funereal predecessors, were works of extraordinary craftsmanship, with embroidery that seemed to shift and change depending on the light. Parents reported that infants dressed in these gowns never cried, remaining unnaturally silent even when hungry or distressed. More disturbing were reports that the babies would stare fixedly at empty corners of rooms, their eyes tracking something invisible to adult observers. The seamstress vanished after creating exactly 13 baptismal gowns. 12 of the children who wore them grew up to lead normal lives, though all were described as unusually quiet, and several developed extraordinary talents in textile arts. The 13th child, Robert Pinckney Hollings, a direct descendant of both Judge William Pinckney and Dr. James Carlisle, disappeared from his crib on his first birthday. When police investigated, they found his baptismal gown laid out on the floor, the embroidery now clearly depicting a woman seated at a loom, pulling threads that extended beyond the edges of the fabric. The Hollings child was never found. The case was officially closed in 1968, listed as a presumed kidnapping with no suspects identified. The investigating officer, Lieutenant Michael Stinson, great-grandson of Captain Robert Stinson, included in his final report a personal note. This case bears disturbing similarities to the Pinckney disappearance of 1889, documented in my great-grandfather's journals. If the same perpetrator is involved, we are dealing with something beyond conventional investigation. The baptismal gown was stored in the evidence room of the Charleston Police Department until 1969, when it disappeared during a renovation of the building. The officer who last saw it reported that the embroidery had changed again, now showing a child, presumably Robert Hollings, seated at a small loom, learning to spin thread from what appeared to be locks of human hair. No further incidents directly attributable to Mrs. Cotton have been documented in Charleston. However, similar patterns of a seamstress creating extraordinary burial garments followed by chains of deaths have been reported in Savannah, 1981 to 1982, Richmond, 1995 to 1996, and Atlanta, 2009 to 2010. In each case, the seamstress disappeared after approximately 1 year, leaving behind no trace except her work, garments that, under microscopic examination, proved to be sewn with thread spun from human hair. What connects these incidents across more than a century? What is the purpose behind this macabre work? The most comprehensive theory comes from Dr. Elizabeth Carlisle, great-granddaughter of Dr. James Carlisle, who has spent her academic career studying what she terms the cotton phenomenon. In her unpublished manuscript, The Thread That Binds, a historical analysis of textile death rituals in the American South, 1964, she proposes the woman known as Mrs. Cotton represents a tradition of retributive justice that operates outside conventional social structures. The targets of her work are not random. They are families whose wealth and position were built upon the exploitation of enslaved workers in the cotton industry. Her method, using human hair as thread, inverts the historical exploitation. Those who profited from the labor of others become, in death, the material for her art. The thread creates a connection between the dead, binding them together in what folklore might call a death web, ensuring that those who benefited from the same system of exploitation share the same fate. Dr. Carlisle's manuscript was never published. According to colleagues at the University of South Carolina, where she taught history, the manuscript disappeared from her office in 1965. Dr. Carlyle herself died in 1967, the same year the seamstress reappeared in Charleston, creating baptismal gowns, found seated at her desk with threads of what appeared to be white cotton wrapped around her fingers. The house at 17 Lagar Street no longer exists, but the lot remains vacant. Development proposals regularly fail to receive approval from the city's historical commission for reasons that change with each application. Local residents avoid walking past the property after dark. Tour guides include it on haunted Charleston walks, though they rarely tell the full story, preferring sanitized versions involving unrequited love or tragic accidents. What remains undeniable is the pattern of burial garments, deaths, and disappearances that stretches across cities and decades, connected by threads spun from human hair and the figure of a woman who calls herself Mrs. Cotton. Whether she represents a multi-generational campaign of revenge, a supernatural entity, or a collective delusion born of historical guilt, the pattern continues. According to records in the Charleston Historical Society, several prominent local families received anonymous packages in 2021, the latest year for which information is available. Each package contained a swatch of white fabric with embroidery depicting a scene specific to the recipient family's history. At the center of each scene was a loom, and seated at that loom, a woman whose face was rendered in such minute detail that it could only be viewed through magnification. The accompanying note, identical in each case, read, "The thread remembers what history forgets. When the debt is paid, the weaving will cease." To date, none of the families who received these packages has experienced unusual deaths or disappearances. Whether this represents the end of the pattern or merely a pause in the weaving remains to be seen. What is certain is that in cities across the South, funeral directors still occasionally receive burial garments of exceptional quality from anonymous sources, and microscopic examination continues to reveal that the thread used in these garments is not cotton at all, but human hair, bleached white and spun with impossible fineness. The last documented sighting of a woman matching Mrs. Cotton's description occurred in Charleston in June of 2022. A tourist photographing the vacant lot on Lagar Street captured the image of a tall woman in black standing at the edge of the property. When the photograph was enlarged, observers noted that she appeared to be holding what looked like a spindle, with white thread trailing from her elongated fingers to the ground. The tourist who took the photograph died 3 weeks later, of what the coroner determined was natural causes. At the funeral, attendees remarked on the extraordinary quality of the burial suit, which the family claimed had been delivered anonymously to their home the day after the death. No one thought to examine the thread from which it was sewn. The web continues to be woven, one stitch at a time, binding past to present, the living to the dead, in a pattern whose full design remains visible only to the weaver herself, the lady of cotton who sews for the dead, and through her work ensures that the debts of history are paid in full, one funeral at a time. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us produce more. A simple like, comment, or share gives us a boost. Visit our channel to discover more stories in different styles. There's always something new waiting for you, and of course, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to be part of our community. I'll see you for the next story.